And it's my great privilege that I can introduce Natalie Gochnour, our speaker today. Thank you.
All right, Kim, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm honored to be with you today at this State of Community Luncheon. I love this community, and except for some time away for summers, for school and service in Washington, D.C., I have been a Salt Laker my entire life, and I love this community, and I recognize the League of Women Voters as part of what makes Salt Lake City and Utah great. I want to thank Kim for that introduction. It's an honor to lead the Kim C. Gardner Policy Institute. I tell people that nobody has a bigger heart for this community than Kim Gardner. And when you work closely with him, you get to see that. He devotes his time, his resources to the betterment of this community. And I want to just thank him for that. Let's give him a hand. Come by the Kim C. Gardner Policy Institute. It's at 411 East South Temple, and you'll see a big, beautiful portrait of Kim that represents that big heart. I also want to thank several of my friends and family members for being here, especially my husband, Chris. Chris is a fine furniture maker and prefers time in his wood shop to fancy hotels. But he's here today, and together we share our very best with each other each day. He's my best friend and my life partner, and I want to thank you, Chris, for everything. Today, I want to talk about our extraordinary home, Utah, and how we can tear down walls to make it even better. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so first let's talk about this special place. And I said to Jennifer Robinson, who's our Associate Director at the Gardner Policy Institute, I said, right at the beginning, I'm going to say this caveat. I want to say right at the beginning that I'm going to share some thoughts with you about making this community better. And they're thoughts that come from my heart. And they're a little edgy and very authentic. And I'm going to be a little vulnerable as I do this. And I'm going to do it because I think it helps our community. But I want to make sure you know that they're not the policies and thoughts of the Kim C. Gardner Policy Institute. I have to do that because we run a top-notch, independent public policy institute that puts data-driven decisions in front of people, and we shed light, not heat. And it wouldn't be appropriate to be at the League of Women Voters Community Luncheon without shedding some heat. Cheryl just did that. I'm not going to get as edgy as you got, Cheryl. So can you give me that space? Is that okay? All right. I love calling Utah home, and apparently others do too. Some of them are even famous, and some of you will know Ty Burrell as the gentleman that has a starring role in ABC's hit series Modern Family. Several years ago, he wrote a letter to the Huffington Post about his affection for Salt Lake City. Do you remember this? Some of you are giving nods. Let me read you some portions of the letter. This was in 2014. He said, "Dear Salt Lake City, ours has been a relatively brief love, but a strong one nonetheless. I met you in 1999 when I did a play at the Pioneer Theater Company as a way of spending more time near my girlfriend, now wife, Holly. I loved you immediately for your humility and your unassuming nature. Over the next 10 years, my wife and I traveled back and forth to spend time with family and began to fall deeper in love with your incredible community. We fell so deeply that we didn't feel like we could be apart anymore, and we moved from New York in 2008. So Ty Burrell has his home here in Salt Lake City. He says, "I'm sorry, but over the past 6 years, we've become stalkers. It's your fault. We didn't realize the incredible impact that having the differing viewpoints of both the religious and secular populations of Utah would have on us. So many cities are actually monocultures, and Salt Lake City has an inherent diversity that's not always apparent. We didn't realize that the earnest good nature of your citizens would lead us to feeling of wanting to pitch in even more, or that it would lead us to investing in this growing community. He goes on to say this, which I think is the most important part. He said, "I'm fairly certain that you're about to explode onto the national scene in the way that some other smaller cities have in the past 10 years. I will try to keep my jealousies at bay as people move here. I'll make you a deal. If, as you grow, you pay attention with great detail to traffic, air quality, conservation, affordable housing, and social justice, then I will work hard to never get so weirdly possessive that you need to take out a restraining order." With love, Ty. Okay, isn't that interesting that he felt compelled to write that, put it in the Huffington Post? It's quite a compliment he paid to us. And his comments remind me of something that was in the Salt Lake Tribune in an editorial in 2007. They said this, quote, "Salt Lake City is still the place, and it's on the move. It retains its unique founding culture and spectacular natural setting, but it also is Utah's most progressive city and increasingly an international crossroads. It is a good city that stands on the cusps of greatness." That was in 2007. So our, major paper of record is reflecting upon our greatness, a Hollywood movie star. But Ty left this cautionary note. He said, "I'll make you a deal. You got to pay attention with great detail to a bunch of items for me to continue to love and champion the great state." In other words, he loves Salt Lake City, but knows it will take purposeful action to keep it great and even make it greater. And that's what I want to talk to you about today, is how to make Salt Lake City and Utah even better. I have a favorite Winston Churchill quote, and I've modified it slightly to match what I'm trying to put across here, but the modified quote goes like this: "First we shape our communities, then they shape us." The quote reminds us that place matters. We not only shape our places shape us. People and place are a two-way street. There's another Brit who invented a word that captures our feelings about our surroundings. It's a British poet named John Bettleman. He combined the Greek word topos, which means place, with the Greek word philia, which means love of, to coin the term love of place, topophilia. Love of place is something that's been here for a long, long time. In 1877, the famous naturalist John Muir said this about Salt Lake City, and remember, this was 140 years ago. So think of springtime in Salt Lake City. John Muir, 140 years ago, he said this: "Most of the houses are veiled with trees, as if set down in the midst of one grand orchard. Homes are set well back from the street, leaving room for a flower garden, while almost everyone has a thrifty orchard at the sides and around the back. The gardens are laid out with great simplicity, indicating love for flowers, by people comparatively poor. In almost every garden you find daisies and mint and lilac bushes and rows of plain English tulips. Lilacs and tulips are the most characteristic flowers, and nowhere have I seen them in greater perfection." That's John Muir. And it sounds a lot like Salt Lake City today, doesn't it? So Muir's quote reminds us of how lovely this place is and how lovely it's been for a very long time. I have one more quote I want to share with you, and this one comes from this community's own Jack Gallivan. Jack was the former publisher at the Salt Lake Tribune, obviously has a central city square named after him. And speaking of community leaders, he said this: "Our task is to make all of Utah as beautiful in man-made additions as it is in God-given wonders. Beautiful in the maintenance of the good life, beautiful in social equality and justice, beautiful in the brotherhood of mankind." Gallivan challenged us to be great stewards of our incredible state. He challenged us to focus on the man-made additions, our life quality, our social equality and justice, and our treatment of one another. He wanted us to make it as stellar as our natural beauty. I have a son that just returned home from well, it wasn't even spring break, but from a college trip to the San Rafael Swell. I looked at the pictures. It is a tall order to make our man-made additions as beautiful as our God-given ones in this state. Okay, so that's the beautiful part about Utah. Now I need to take a little side road and talk about another framing of sorts. I've spent a bit of time getting us to think about our love of place. I want you to now think about something different. I want you to think about walls. Stick with me as this will all come together at the end. So there are many famous walls in our history. The Great Wall of China extends like 12,000 miles. At one time, it was the largest man-made object in the world. It stands as a fortress of military power. The Berlin Wall, it's modern history's most infamous wall. That might be replaced, by the way. The so-called Wall of Shame stood for more than 28 years before coming down in 1989. It was built to keep people in rather than keep people out. That's why it was shameful. Another wall that some of you may think of as a poetic wall is a rock anthem called The Wall by Pink Floyd. You didn't think you'd come today to talk about what Cheryl talked about and Pink Floyd, but here goes. The award-winning collection of songs is a story about a young man struggling with abandonment and personal isolation. It's a metaphorical wall that represents the main character's separation from society. And then there's the great, great wall on our southern border that some high-placed people speak of in our country. This wall, it is said, will be paid for by the Republic of Mexico. And I'm going to leave it at that. So we have an ancient wall for military purposes, a shameful wall to restrict people's freedoms, a literary wall of personal isolation, and a border wall to divide countries who used to be friends. If you can't guess, I don't like walls. I don't like what they represent, and I don't like what they do. They separate, they divide, they prevent people from associating with one another, from learning from different life experiences, and from pursuing their dreams and realizing human potential. In most instances, I don't think walls are a good thing. I have a favorite poem about walls written by American poet Robert Frost. Some of you will know this poem. It's called Mending Wall. And it's about two neighbors that don't ever talk except for once a year when they get together to go pile up the rocks that create the border between their properties, the mending wall. And they talk as they put up the little stones in the wall. And the famous line from that poem, I'll resist the temptation to read you the poem, although Kim would like that. Something there is that doesn't love a wall is how it begins. But at one point, a neighbor says to the other neighbor, "Good fences make good neighbors." That's the famous line from the poem. Good fences make good neighbors. Ouch. Do you believe that? Do you think fences make good neighbors? I want to take the next few minutes and give you a few examples of neighborhoods and people with fences or walls. And the walls I will describe are not physical walls, but invisible walls. They are walls to opportunity, walls that keep one group of people in one place and another group in another. They are walls that limit human potential. The first example comes from a book that's spreading like wildfire, the New York Times bestseller, Hillbilly Elegy. This book chronicles the experiences of a young man who lived in the white underclass of America's Appalachia region that could just as well have been places in Utah. The book is attracting an extraordinary amount of attention because it explains many of the sentiments felt by voters in the 2016 election. The book makes clear that something isn't working in America. Making America great again has something to do with restoring opportunity to people who have been left behind. I think that's why the book has gotten so much interest. So the author, who's now a Yale Law School graduate, writes about what he referred to as the hub of misery among the troubling situations he felt in his childhood. Let me give you a couple of examples. He talks about a mother putting Pepsi inside the bottle of a 9-month-old. He talked about the short supply of virtuous fathers. He talked about a young girl giving birth to a child and burying a child before being old enough to drive. He talked about the gaming of the welfare system. He talked about a young mother who lost her baby like she lost her car keys. And he talked about giving of his own urine for his mother's drug test so she wouldn't lose her job. These are sobering. He also talked about his grandmother. This is a bright spot. Speaking of his grandmother, he said, quote, "The theology she taught was unsophisticated, but it provided a message I needed to hear. To coast through life was to squander my God-given talent, so I had to work hard. I had to take care of my family because Christian duty demanded it. I needed to forgive, not just for my mother's sake, but for my own. I should never despair, for God had a plan." End of quote. You can see why this book has gotten so much interest when he's writing like that. So America's Appalachian region is a long ways from Salt Lake City, but the misery he describes exists here too, and many of the remedies are here as well. Okay, let's do another example. Let's go this time to Baltimore, Maryland. We're going to talk about another example, but could also exist in the Beehive State. I teach a public finance class at the University of Utah. My textbook introduces the topic of inequality by sharing data about Baltimore, Maryland, and the neighborhood where Freddie Gray grew up. And you'll remember Freddie Gray is the gentleman, the young man who died in police custody during a period of protests in Baltimore. My economic text points out that in Freddie Gray's neighborhood of Sandtown, Winchester, the average life expectancy is 67 years. Just 3 miles away, in the wealthy Baltimore neighborhood of Roland Park, the life expectancy is 81 years. 67, 81, a shocking 14 years of difference. In Freddie Gray's neighborhood, the life expectancy is the same as the U.S. average in 1948. So much for modern medicine. In fact, there's 15 neighborhoods in Baltimore that have life expectancy lower than that of North Korea. Another ouch, right? Okay, I was really moved by this example, and in ways that I can't explain. Pam Perlich was thinking about this, who works at the Gardner Policy Institute. I was thinking about it. She pulled the data that would show this interesting stat. The life expectancy at birth today in Foothill is 84.7, and 6 miles away in Glendale is 10 years less. So just kind of think about that for a minute. Salt Lake City's not Baltimore, but Salt Lake City's not paradise either. We can do better. The walls of inequality, unequal opportunity, human hardship show their faces here in many ways. Let me just give you a few examples. The most obvious example right now is our community's struggle to select locations for homeless service centers, and to do so with civility and grace. I'm certain many people in this community would like a few do-overs, including community leaders who allowed our homeless services to deteriorate to the depth of despair found in Salt Lake City's Rio Grande neighborhood. It got out of control in our valley and created some of the problems we've just experienced. But let's do give a hand of thank you to the people who've helped get us to this point. Particularly, I'm thinking of Gail Miller and Mayor Ben McAdams. Another example is we have far too many children living in poverty. The Utah Department of Workforce Services reports that the number of Utah children in poverty could fill 1,611 school buses. Imagine the 24th of July parade with all of those ceremonial floats filled with school buses of children who live in want and fear. Here's another example. High school graduation rates range from 68% in Ogden School District to 98% in this Park City area. I learned early in my career that a high school dropout is almost always on a sure path to poverty. We have to do better. And then just one more example. The most recent jobs report reports that the economies in 7 rural counties contracted in the last year. They're getting smaller. And nowhere can that stand out more clearly than when you look at the demographic data that shows that the median age in many rural Utah counties is getting much, much older than the state. In the 1960s, they were about the same. Everybody's gotten older, but rural Utah is getting older much, much faster. The children leave, they don't come back, the parents age. That's not a good situation. Okay, I share these as just a few of the big challenges affecting our state. Obviously, there are others, and it would be so wrong for me to not also share a lot of the great things happening in Utah. And there are many, from being the best state for business, to being the fastest growing state, to being the best managed state, to having one of the lowest unemployment rates in the country, to having stellar fiscal responsibility, to doing noble things for refugees, to being kind and friendly, and so on. Okay, it's a long, long list. Let's be clear, we are great people living in prosperous times. Don't let anything I'm saying take away from that sparkle, that shine, that wonder that is Utah. It's because we are doing so well that I want us to do more. So in the spirit of Jack Gallivan, let's ask the questions. How do we make Utah as beautiful in man-made additions as it is in God-given wonders? How do we make it beautiful in social equality and justice? How do we make it beautiful in the brotherhood of mankind? Well, I wouldn't be a woman worth my salt if I didn't have a few ideas. So number one, tear down the metaphorical walls that separate us. That's my first recommendation. Fences don't make good neighbors, people do. We must look for these walls and take the challenge to tear them down. Walls between the opportunities for each gender, walls between different races and ethnicities, walls between people of faith, walls between political ideologies, walls between urban and rural, and walls between neighborhoods. Tear down the walls. Second, I don't think we should segregate rich and poor into enclaves. It just creates bigger pools of misery. It's better to blend human experience together and learn from one another. We should think less about property values and keeping up with the Joneses and more about human beings. Third idea, we devote too many resources to help with the effects of poverty too late in the game. We need to intervene early. That's why I find investment in high-quality pre-kindergarten programs so appealing. Utah loves children, let's invest in them. I've only got three more, okay? Three more ideas. Fourth, let's quit fighting about education and start doing something. There are dozens of interventions and changes that would help Utah students succeed. We need to quit talking and start doing. And I would start by fixing educational governance, which I believe is a mess in our state. The governor has no power. The legislature micromanages too much, which is another way of saying too much power. And nobody knows who the school board is. I think the governor of this state should be entrusted with more power to improve public and higher education. Looks like some agree with me. So just an edgy one to throw out there. That tells you that I worked on the executive branch for 11 years. Okay, fifth idea, we need good, strong families and lots of grandparents, period, full stop. We need to make public policies that support working families and senior Utahns. I'm talking about pro-family policies in education, healthcare, tax policy, childcare, all these things that will help families in this state succeed. Children, parents, and grandparents are the best part of life. Let's make them a priority. And finally, and this one I didn't have in here last night until I went to dinner with my husband and he mentioned it, so you can kind of take credit for this, Chris. The electoral and political walls in the state are too high. Too many of our electoral districts protect people in power and stifle alternative voices. Town halls, when we have them, that's supposed to kind of make you laugh, have become places of protest. I would love to see an independent redistricting commission to help us draw electoral district lines. 21 states use an independent or bipartisan process to draw electoral boundaries, and our state would be well served to become the 22nd state. Such a move would help us tear down some of the walls of partisanship in this state and do much to enliven the marketplace of ideas. All right, these are just a few ideas. I'm sure you have more. That's basically my vulnerable part because some of those things are